fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
There's actually two books here that I read went in this. Both are very, very good books. They're very, very complementary to each other, and that's why I did both. But that's why, you know, they kind of say the same things. However, one was written quite some time ago. So the first book is The National System of Political Economy. This is published by Imperium Press. It's by Frederich List. And the original publishing date of this was 1909. So a lot of this, some of it, the examples might sound dated, so I'm not going to go through everything in it, but 1909. The second book is just called Free Trade Doesn't Work by Ian Fletcher. And this one was published in 2011. So it's just interesting that over a century apart, these books can be making very, very similar claims and have very, very similar solutions to how to handle the issue of international free trade and the impact it has on nations. And in that sense, I think Frederich List here was vindicated by time. I think a lot of things he talks about, he did not have exposure to all the things we learned over the course of the 20th century. You know, this is 1909. Just sit and think about how long ago that was. All the shit he didn't see when he was saying these right things. But I'm going to kind of explain the concept of why global free trade, you know, if people are, you know, out there who like free trade, you know, I'm just going to say what they're saying. And I think a lot of it is correct. I think the vast majority of it is correct. And what I like about this is it's not just complaining about world trade and free trade. It is giving solutions, what I would say are very practical solutions on what nations could do right now to improve their state, and not just advanced manufacturing nations, but developing nations as well. But we'll get into that a bit later. So I'll start with the first book, The National System of Political Economy. So what's that about? A lot of this book is written as a response to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, you'll know, wrote The Wealth of Nations. So this was a foundational text about the power and, you know, why free trade works, why global free trade works. And a lot of people will read that about free trade and about Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was a very, very smart guy, very, you know, influential name in world history. But they were sort of this new school of economics was saying, they actually called the old school in a lot of these books. But when they came about, it was this idea that, you know what, and this is very popular in liberal thought, by the way. Like, you know what? A lot of all these differences and these divisions and these conflicts, they're socially constructed. And beneath it all, people are just self-interested. And there is a mercantile class in every nation. And it seemed, and this is still believed, when we were talking about Nassim Taleb in his book, The Black Swan, he actually makes a claim like this. He's like, you know, traditionally in the world, everywhere in the world, go back to these big trading nations, where there was a mercantile city or a mercantile class, there was less fighting. As long as there's trading and mercantilism, everything's peaceful. And so this theory was like, well, why don't we just heighten that? Why don't we just put mercantilism at the center of society and use that as a mediating force between all these different groups and nations?
The idea that Adam Smith is most famous for is the idea of the invisible hand of the market. He was a champion of what we have come to call today the free market. People should be able to trade their goods with one another however they see fit. You should just let them go. If government had a role in the market, it was simply to guarantee the enforcement of economic contracts. If I say I'm going to pay you for the widgets that you produce, then somebody has got to see that I pay you, that I follow through. That was really the role of government. But his theory, and it was almost a moral theory of the market, was that if all the various economic players, the laborers, the producers, the manufacturers, the farmers, if everybody pursued their maximum self-interest economically, if everybody pursued maximum profit, then what would happen is that the overall market would rationalize. It would become incredibly efficient. And an efficient market created more and more wealth. If everybody pursues their self-interest, all of society will be better off. He said that this benefit of the market was like an invisible hand.
Which, to be fair, works to a point, I'm sure. But what we will see is that how that mutates over time. But that's kind of what it's founded on, this idea of, the sovereign individual, all that classical liberal stuff, but also this hyper mercantilism and the idea that free trade through mercantilism can make the world a peaceful and safe place. And because really the quote was like, if everyone's rich, why would anyone fight? If everyone's rich and prosperous and fat and their lands are filled with milk and honey, why would there be anything such as a war? And then, the 20th century can have many cases that conflict with that. But that was the belief. And that was what a lot of these books are kind of arguing against. And this is the reason it's relevant, is this is still accepted in the modern day. Most liberals still believe this. Globalists still believe this. Most of these NGOs believe this as well, to one form or another. So what Frederich List says, I'm going to kind of start with some of the big pillars of the argument that I'm going to get through and kind of talk about some historical stuff and then talk about solutions. But he will say that the power of producing wealth is more important than wealth itself and how it moves. Now, when he says that, that's kind of interesting. So one thing that you hear from a lot of nations is that, you stole our resources. We had a wealth of resources and you stole them and now we got nothing. And the claim that's made in both of these books, that in a lot of ways, no nation is actually made rich and powerful on resources. All the rich and powerful nations got that way because of manufacturing. In fact, and if your nation is just an exporter of resources, there is a very low ceiling on how much you can advance. That if you want to have a prosperous nation, you need to start manufacturing. What do we mean by manufacturing? Now, when I say manufacturing, what people think of is black chimneys, belching smoke and fire and polluted rivers and stuff. That's not really what it is. It doesn't need to be like that. It doesn't need to be environmental catastrophe. What manufacturing really is just the ability to employ specialists and raise the education of the people, to have these facilities where you can transform one thing into another thing. They can transform resources into products, and you can transform products into more intricate products. And this can be everything from, when I say that, people are thinking, oh, like a circuit board. Yeah, that, but also pinheads. Manufacturing a pin, manufacturing a screw. Do you know what it goes into manufacturing a fucking screw? It's actually really complicated. It's more complicated than growing a turnip. You need to have all these facilities. You need people running machines. You need to have precision cutting, and you need to have quality control. You need all this stuff. And so that's when he says, the companies, the nations that seem to rise are the ones that actually employ some form of manufacturing, because what manufacturing does is it raises up everything around it. One phrase that comes up a lot is ladder externalities. A ladder externality is like, when a new industry starts rising up, it kind of raises up all these other satellite industries around them in orbit, and that's if you have a nationalist sort of outlook. You can do it where you export all that stuff. But I'm just saying, just to start, that's what it is. So how you actually produce wealth matters more than what wealth you have. Because there's a lot of countries that have wealth. There's a lot of countries out there, like African countries. They have a lot of diamonds, or they have one resource or material that is used in manufacturing cell phones. That you can have all that. That's kind of a stroke of luck. There's a lot of environmental luck that people have. But then you look at a nation like Germany. Now, Germany, the history of Germany, there is no fucking reason why Germany should just be as powerful, influential as it is, other than the fact that its people employed these policies. Because we talked about this before in the Tragedy of Great Power Politics and other books, where one of the things Britain always had going for it was that it was ocean locked. It had a barrier of water between them and the rest of the world. That actually works very, very well. That works very well for America, by the way. Germany doesn't. Germany is surrounded by enemies. It's been decimated how many times, and it always rises back up. Germany has been ruined and decimated more than any African country you can think of. And it actually doesn't have a wealth of resources like a lot of these African countries ready for export. So what is the story of Germany? How does Germany still exist? How does Germany still thrive? Well, it employs this. So you cannot give me these examples of South America and Africa and even the Middle East, because it actually comes, I was going to get to this later, but I'll lead with this. It actually comes down to the people. It isn't as much as your resources as you would like to believe. And just to put a pin on that, I'll give you an example. I was going to say this later, but I'll say it now. So NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, people would say NAFTA and its consequences has been a disaster. Okay. So what NAFTA did was it got America to put a lot of its manufacturing in Mexico. Fair. And then a lot of that manufacturing is moving from Mexico elsewhere. And then Mexicans like, well, what are we supposed to fucking do? And the question is, what did you do with the manufacturing that you had? Because any other country, they would actually build up their infrastructure. They had all this manufacturing, but you never did.
NAFTA, the controversial North American Free Trade Agreement. It wiped out border taxes between Canada, the US, and Mexico almost 25 years ago. In the eyes of President Trump, Mexico was the big winner.
And they're killing us at the border, and they're killing us in trade. They're killing us.
He's long talked about the US's massive trade deficit with its southern neighbor. But behind the numbers, many Mexicans question what they've really gained. Chief among them are small-scale farmers.
Just like these African countries, like the fact is that when you're exporting hand over fist and you're making all this money, what nations typically do is they reinvest that money in the infrastructure in the nation. These places just never do. They never reinvest and try and develop. And that is 100% on them. It's not about the resources. It's not about pretty much every nation that has ever risen to prominence in the world has had a relationship with sort of what you might call vulture capitalism. Britain was leading this. Britain and the Anglos were notorious for this, about like trying to get other nations to do the work for them, and then promoting free trade for everyone else except for them and using protectionist policies. But a lot of these other nations, they did that for a while, and then they became protectionist. Then they made a decision to build up their own stuff, to not be dependent on Britain and to not, or whoever it might be. And some nations make that call and other nations just don't. And we can discuss why that might be, maybe blame the WTO or something, but or it's just the people kind of fucking suck and don't think that's important. That's a big problem too. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off in the weeds on that one. That'll come up later. He makes a point here, and this is kind of the foundational pillar points. He says, the free market puts commerce above production and manufacturing, whereas in a national model, it should be inverted. So most global free market proponents, like the neocons, they think, as long as trade and commerce is happening, that's good. As long as the money's moving and trade's happening, that's good. Whereas the idea that you should be producing and manufacturing your own stuff and creating these ladder externalities where by, a side effect, it raises up everything else, that should actually come first, not just the movement of stuff. And that's kind of where America is locked into now. We'll get into that later. And he makes the claim that a nation is determined by variety and division of occupations and the collaboration of productive powers. So, we ask the question, what is a nation? How do we describe a nation? Is it just a country? No, he's like, you need, for it to be consistent, internally consistent, you need a variety of different occupations that kind of all need to be working together in some way. Most importantly, the collaboration between agriculture and industry, and how you define that relationship is actually very, very important. But it needs to be collaborative in that sense. And that's how you can tell a strong national economy, which is in truth what Canada and Ontario is trying to do right now. This doesn't get brought up a lot, but there is a big push in Canada and where I live in Ontario right now to bring manufacturing back. They're throwing money at manufacturing. They're trying to get back. So, say what you will about Canada. There's a lot of hate about this country. The one under the table thing that I've noticed is their like advanced manufacturing specifically is what they're trying to bring back. Like making big machines, big intricate machines, and making them well is something that Canada's investing in. Millions and millions, probably could be giving more money, but I won't turn my nose up at that. And he says, and on the topic of what is a nation, he says the prosperity of a nation is tied to the intelligence, morality, and industry of the people, but it cannot succeed without national institutions. So he says, a lot of people who are statist think that, oh, we can have this thing called the state and the people are just whatever we fill it with. He's like, no, this actually comes from the people. The people must be industrious. The people must be educated. The people must coordinate on their own. But the state can actually facilitate that. The state can actually help that along. You see what I'm saying? And to help raise these businesses up. Whereas, it can't just be, forcing people to go into factories, which is what I think a lot of people think of. So he defines the nation how we would define the nation, as this perfect synergy between these productive forces, rather than just this top-down state and subordinates, which is what a lot of people jump to, I think. And he says this can actually go wrong, because he says, and I think this is true, advanced nations tend to become focused on intellectual pursuits rather than like cultivating the mind and cultivating their industry, which is, I think, where we are at right now. It's like you can get so good at manufacturing that you're like, we're just going to talk about weird stuff now. That's he's saying we got to get out of that. This wasn't as bad as when it was written, obviously, but and he actually lays out his description of what he calls the Adam Smith school of thought. He kind of lays it out here. He says, the system of the school suffers, as we've already shown in the preceding chapters, from the three main defects. Firstly, from boundless cosmopolitanism, which neither recognizes the principle of nationality nor takes into consideration the satisfaction of its interests. Secondly, from a dead materialism, which everywhere regards chiefly the mere exchangeable value of things without taking into consideration the mental and political, the present and the future interests and the productive powers of the nation. Thirdly, from a disorganizing particularism and individualism, which, ignoring the nature and character of social labor and the operation of the union powers, considers private industry only as it would develop itself under the state of free interchange with society, were that race not divided into separate and national. That last one kind of gets weird. But that's what he says, like the three main problems are that the way we do production and mercantilism actually doesn't serve the people, and it actually doesn't take the long view. It doesn't actually plan ahead. As long as the money's moving now, that's what matters. And they get into this in the second book, Why Free Trade Doesn't Work. That's kind of where America is stuck at now, and in Canada, in the West, where it's like we don't produce anything, but we're moving assets around. We're selling off our assets. America sells off its fucking assets and its land and all kinds of shit to foreign interests. And, they'll say, oh, that's no big deal. That's actually good because we're more interconnected. But from a production standpoint, that means like you're not even producing anything. You're just selling off what you have, which puts you in a negative position. Yeah. And I'll get into this right now. And if you want to say something, you can, but I'll just say this right now. In the second book, he says, an easy way to look at this is we sell three things: what we produced yesterday, what we're producing now, or what we will produce in the future. What we produced yesterday is selling off assets, selling off like our buildings and our fucking cities, which we literally do. What we produce today is what we're producing. And what we will produce in the future is us taking loans, the promise of production in the future. And he says, we do the first and third very, very well. We take out loans that promise the future, or we sell off the stuff we've already accumulated. And that's a bad place to be in. And people will say that this creates sort of a mutually assured destruction between us and these other great powers, that there's so much interconnected debt, then everything's okay. I'm like, that's a bad model. I don't buy that. Sorry, I think I might have cut you off. Were you about to say something?
Not really. I wanted to, for once in my life, disagree with the book, but not entirely. Okay. But I do like his critique, because I'm a big Adam Smith boy. But his critique had always kind of been my critique, which is not so much a critique of the principle of free trade, but the execution, like the example of free trade that we actually get in government, which is which is kind of the nature of government, the nature of democracy, right? You always get a very basic bitch first order execution of the principle, which doesn't take into account nationality and doesn't take into account the health of the people and all of these other things. But if you take like a Misesian view of it, you get more, like if you get more praxeology involved and you start to you find a way to price in that praxis, you can have at least regional free trade. I think you can have regional free trade where you are pricing in the health of the people and the health of the nation, and it can function. And I think the extent to which, like you said at the beginning, free trade does operate all right on a small local level within small communities. The reason that works is actually because people have natural intuitive systems of pricing in their praxeology when they make negotiations in a market, right? But it's almost impossible to do that globally when you have these governments which are so disconnected from the actual praxeological needs of their people. Those needs never make it to the market, and so you get totally corrupted. And like you said, you have governments that are selling off infrastructure that have taken centuries to build and selling them off in one season to what is like, from a geopolitical standpoint, you're selling it to literally your enemy, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, if there was a way for the government to take that praxeological view, then you can have free trade, because the free trade is just the system, but you wouldn't be making the bad bargain, because you go into the market and, you know, China would say to the US, can I buy the Rust Belt? And the US would say, absolutely not. The Rust Belt just isn't for sale because I understand what it's worth. But what actually happens is say, yeah, sure. How about $1,000? It's yours. It's full of crack-headed white guys. I don't care. You can have it, right? So it's not about the system.
China.
Yeah, no, but really,
Yeah.
the point is, it's not about it's not that the system itself. I mean, the system is agnostic. Like, you shouldn't be passing judgment on the system. You're passing judgment on the deals that people are. It's a game, right? So it's like, who's winning this game? And the answer, like you said, is mutually assured destruction, because of it's. You know what it is? It's a game that's too complicated for us to play on a global scale, and everybody is losing at this game. When this game is played globally, it's a game that we used to play on the community level, and it works okay. And we tried to play it globally, and now all of us are dying. All of the players have cancer. So we need to find a new way to play this game.
Yeah, well, he makes a couple really good points here, and he said the solutions he has are very, very simple. So I'll start by saying he describes around 3 phases that every successful nation has gone through. And this belief, this study kind of informs everything else that comes from it. He says every nation they start off, pre-industrial. They start off by just their resources. And there is a period where you're just selling off your resources, even to a more advanced country. And as you're selling them off, you're getting wealth, you're getting money back. And sometimes you're getting cash, you're getting other resources. Sometimes you're actually trading for other manufactured goods back. But this happened in Britain. This happened in all these countries where there came a point where they said, we need to start manufacturing ourselves. We actually don't want to be reliant on these foreign powers. And what they do is they start building up their industries. And usually they build up these industries with support from the government. And this could be everything from, manufacturing textiles. This could be, starting a shoe factory, starting making screws and pinheads. This could be whatever it is, whatever manufacturing, big factory assembly line, whatever it is. You start manufacturing stuff yourself. Then comes a period of protectionism. And this is essential. And this is where most countries, they get lost and they don't do it. They said, after you build up these manufacturing, you need to actually support them by imposing new tariffs on all the other, usually on the guy you were trading with. So if you were trading to get nails from this country, you start building your own nails, you're going to impose a steep protectionist tariff on the import of nails. So they don't, to build up your industry. This is what every single nation has done. This is what Britain did. This is what Germany did. This is what America did. So you need a period of protectionism. And then after you build that up, then you can enter the free market. And he actually says entering the free market at this stage is essential, because he said what you can end up in, if you develop your industries and you develop these nations and you develop your manufacturing productive wealth generating capabilities, you actually do need competition at that point, because the risk there is that these big, powerful industries you've got will become too reliant on government support. They won't actually improve. They will become, distant and ossified. We've seen this happen time and time again. You said, re-entering the global market at this stage is actually beneficial to kind of keep the competitive edge and make sure it's always improving, so it doesn't get too lazy. It becomes this sort of monopoly, this dead monopoly. So he's to his point, he says that. I'm like, okay, but those are the 3 phases. You start off, you need the middle protectionist phase. And he says, and I think this is true, a lot of the proponents of free market economics don't actually practice it themselves. It's just something they lie to developing nations about. So, a lot of people will say, Dimes, there's no such thing as even the free market and free trade. That's true. There is currency manipulation that occurs. Of course, there are tariffs that exist. The various countries have protectionist policies. It's not unheard of. So if people say, "Oh, there's no such thing as global free trade," true to a point. We're also just saying that when it comes down to it, people will be protectionist when it matters, and a lot of nations will sell this free market thing to nations they want something out of just because they want them to do it more cheaply, while at the same time doing protectionist policies to kind of shore up their own industries. And he makes the argument that you can't. He makes an argument against having these sort of vassal states. Because, Frederich List, this is published. People look at this guy and they say, oh my God, he's this radical right wing guy. You read this book, there's a lot of times in here where he's just talking about how using nationalist politics like this could actually raise up these undeveloped and developing nations to their own level and make it so they're not vassal states of these more powerful nations. And that will get us to world peace. Now, we can debate that all we want. But he's coming at it from a very egalitarian point of view. It's not racist. In fact, in this book, I was talking to Mike from Imperium Press about this. There's a point where he's talking about how, race mixing is the most beautiful thing in the world. And, the best thing you could do to make beautiful, genetically strong children is to have as many mulatto, mix with black people as much as you can. And I'm like, that's kind of funny. And he was like, Mike was like, I was debating taking that. And I'm like, no, keep it in. Don't editorialize the book. But it is funny that this guy was, for all intents and purposes, he's seen as a right-wing nationalist guy, but he had these very arguably liberal meanings of his. He wants the fucking Klaus Schwab world. He just thinks it's nation states that can do it. Whatever.
Yeah, that's funny.
But it was funny. But that's what he was saying about how to encourage nations to go through these phases so they can do some sort of manufacturing on their own. Now, there's some nations that won't be able to, because he makes a valid point that says, and this is where anarchists get caught up, where they say, oh, we should all just be farming land. Look at all this farmable land. You shouldn't hitch your wagon to an agricultural society being the best form of society. Because like I said, there's a very low ceiling on what you can do. You're a slave to the markets on the prices. You actually have very little control over what you can produce agriculturally. But with manufacturing, one of the ways he defines manufacturing and defines a good industry is that it can absorb capital. So a good factory is the more money you throw at it, the more it can produce. Now, you can get into an agricultural situation where the more money you throw at it, it doesn't matter. You can only grow so much wheat, and you're a slave to the weather and the climate. And some countries just can't grow stuff there. Whereas a manufacturing base is scalable. You could scale it as big as you want. And the idea is that you put $1 in, $2 comes out consistently. That's what manufacturing is. It absorbs capital, and it absorbs it with research and development that can always get better. And there's no ceiling on it. And, we can say that it probably shouldn't get so big, but that's that's a different type of debate. So that's why he's saying, if you want to go back to an agricultural society, he's like, well, you're not going to have a lot of power. And actually, if you can, this is what Mao did. A lot of the communists and a lot of the Soviets, people will poo-poo their very, very aggressive industrial revolution. And, there was millions and millions who died, and it was total savagery. And they did it in a very Chinese way. Where they just threw peasant suffering at it until it got better. I get that. Same thing with Russia. But they recognize the fact that what manufacturing represents is having total sovereignty over what they produce. That means that the wealth of your nation is limited only by really your organizational capabilities and your imagination. That's why manufacturing is important. And if you're stuck in an agricultural subsistence sort of society, you can live like that, but you actually have less control over your future. So that's one way to look at it. Why would anyone even want to do this? Why are people interested in manufacturing? Who cares about just making tires? I'm like, not really. The concept of manufacturing is it can absorb capital and it can actually scale, whereas other types of things can't scale. And if you're just based on resources, if you're hitching your wagon to I can just cut down more trees, that's not scalable. That's actually the opposite of scalable. That can only go down. The best case scenario is you stay exact, you just keep replanting. But with oil, there is going to be a time when there's not as much. I mean, there's going to, same with anything you cut down or dig out of the fucking ground, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And he actually does blame Britain. He's this is very early 20th century. He says the Britain is the bad guy and all this. And there's a lot of Anglo haters out there who, fair enough, they can make a solid case for that. But he had said that it was actually Britain that designed these maritime laws and tried to get all these bad trade deals with people, which I'm sure did happen. But he blames like the supremacy on Britain on why nations are kept apart and kept at bay with different bad transport laws and bad tariffs and things like that. Whether or not that's true is one thing, but that's what he believes. And he makes a case because he was a German guy. He makes a case for how Germany could fight against that. And he said that for Germany to be a contender against Britain, they would essentially have to invade and take over Scandinavia. He said, we need access to the water. We need, and he's like, we're kind of the same people anyway. He sounded like some of the guys in our chat, a lot of those people. So he makes a solid case that we should just invade Denmark and just like carve a path to the ocean, and that will bring unity to the world. So this is one of those cases where once again conquest and war is like, no, we'll when we do it, it's going to be good. And there's a lot of people who think that would be good, who actually take over Scandinavia, and to combat Britain and America specifically, because he was a firm believer that to be a trade superpower, you need access and sovereignty in the oceans. People can debate that all they want. I think there's a lot of truth to it. And the course of this was, he was saying this about Germany, and historically he was pointing to the development of Britain and also Italy. He said the people who realized that they need to centralize their power around manufacturing actually started with Venice. Venice led the way historically in developing the maritime laws and centralizing their power in cities. This was 100 centuries ago, followed by Germany and then England. And England was a third one to advance through manufacture and through processes, broke free of the merchants and trade by, there was this one group of like the trade union back then who were kind of controlling the things. And the story of how England centralized its power through manufacturing and took back over is kind of what he's talking about right now. And that, if anyone's wondering, that's what China's trying to do right now. This isn't old hat stuff. This is stuff people are doing right now. Like a lot of people, like with Mearsheimer and the great power politics, he's saying this is how it's been historically. It's still relevant now, and you ignore it at your peril. And, like we said, he proposed some options for what we can do. Like he said, if we see the nation as the fundamental building block as global trade and keep it the nation, then we can actually negotiate and trade. Now, we obviously go too far with these other globalist policies, but it's like, you can't get bigger than the nation. And the nation's job is to take care of its people and to have that far time horizon. Because if a nation doesn't have a far time horizon, what is the purpose of the nation? Right. Like you pointed out, the three things that were wrong with free trade right now, it's like they don't actually care about long-term gains. They care that the money's circulating now. But then for what reason do we have nations? The only purpose, just like having a king, having a monarch, the purpose of the fucking monarch is to have some guy there who can look 1,000 years in the future and make decisions that are relevant to that now.
That's exactly it.
So if you don't do that, yeah, exactly. And he had made a point, and I kind of made a note of this. There's two things that I think make this relevant now. So in a sense, the way free trade works now is, in my view, it turns even advanced nations into agricultural societies, but with technology. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, if your whole thing as a nation is just making corn or producing cotton, right, you will become a vassal state to a larger manufacturing nation. You're limited by what they're willing to buy, what they're willing to pay for it, whatever it might be, and you'll never have that sovereignty on your own. Now, the way we've diversified and the way we've offshored all of our manufacturing, because we essentially do the same thing. So one thing, so it's like this is what kind of Japan used to do in that area, in that region. They would have the like flock of geese strategy, where we are going to lead the research and development industrialization, and we're going to offshore specific manufacturing to different other Asian countries like Manchuria and whatnot. And they're just going to be kind of our vassal states, even though they are manufacturing, right? Because you can have a country that manufactures things, that has a factory in it. America does this. You'll have a factory, but that factory doesn't actually raise up the things around it. It just produces one part for the cell phone and stuff. But that essentially makes you an agricultural society, but you're just producing complicated things. So it's not really a manufacturing society. You just parked a factory there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it has all the bad parts of being a manufacturing of an agricultural society, and that's kind of how it's worked out right now. So one company, Apple, has the iPhone produced in like 7 different countries, and they get resources from this country and this part from this country, that part, and it all comes together. And here's a trick: the most powerful country is usually the country where the components are assembled in.
Yeah.
So just even if the global free trade market right now, so there are technically manufacturing nations, but they don't have any of the benefits. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And another thing that I noticed is, consider this: a lot of people are in favor of universal basic income, UBI, and free trade. The people who are proponents of UBI are typically those who don't even see an end to free trade. I think they see free trade, the globalist financial system and mercantile system as something they can't even touch. So we might as well get universal basic income, because what else are you going to do? There's a couple people, let me just say, there's a couple people who like UBI. One group is that they truly believe that the purpose of humanity is to be a creature of leisure, that the best that they can be is just lounging on a beach and painting. There's the other group that sees UBI as just a way to rob the system that they hate. That they say they're giving money to everyone else. Fuck the system. This was like Ann Coulter when she was becoming part of the Yang Gang a while ago, where it's like everyone else is getting money. Why not us too? Fuck it. Fuck them all. I want to get paid at least. Those are the two types of UBI people I've seen. But let's say with the rise of UBI and free trade, the workers and the people are no longer seen as assets, but rather than impediments. Now let's unpack that for a second. In a national system, a nationalist system, where the government, the state, is saying, look, what we're trying to do is support our people, support businesses. The health and education of the people are important to us. We can become a more wealthy nation, and that wealth is tied inexorably to the education and prosperity of these people. Now, if you have a UBI system and you have a free trade system, they're not really concerned about your prosperity anymore. In fact, UBI is always talked about as a way to get you to shut up. It's like, we're going to do this global free trade. We're going to make our money. We're going to make our wealth, and we're going to allocate our wealth in a different way. And we're actually just proposing this UBI thing because we don't even see you as valuable assets anymore. You're just something we need to get to shut up. So whereas before people talk about workers' rights, people talk about, if you're a libertarian or an anarchist or even a Marxist, this should be relevant to you, because this is the wholesale devaluation of workers, period. No country in the world actually needs to give a shit about workers. And as automation becomes more relevant, and as we're manufacturing more in different places that are competing against each other, your education doesn't really matter to them anymore. Your prosperity, your happiness doesn't fucking matter to manufacturers, companies, Apple anymore, because rather than your happiness, it's your silence that they value. And so what's the best way? And maybe the way to get you silent isn't by making you rich and prosperous. It's just making it so you're not uncomfortable enough to cause a problem. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is the live in the pods, eat the bugs. We don't need to go off on the whole thing, but really think about what you're standing to lose by going along this, by not actually seeing the problem for what it is.
Yeah.
So that was the first book. And I know I'm kind of going a bit longer, but I think this is relevant. So Like in the National System Political Economy, we're talking about free trade doesn't work. Very, very good book. I would, if I had to recommend one, I might recommend this one. I think everyone should buy The National System of Political Economy by Imperium Press. Great book. This one says a lot of that, but it backs it up with a bit more math and a bit more modern examples. And it has the benefit of having the rest of the 20th century to call back to, because, Frederick List, like, this is pre-World War II. This is before the Communist Revolution, not the Communist Revolution, but, the Soviet Union, all that shit. So we can look back and kind of put new inputs into this theory and see how it works. So like in the previous book, he says, nations are the status quo of the global marketplace, and nations need to have a strategic and not unconditional relationship with trade. So this is kind of what we were saying before, that we can have free trade, but it can't be unconditional. You can't have free trade as almost an ideology, is kind of what he's saying. And this is counter to the Adam Smith thing. We can say we like trade in the same way we like gravity. Like, you can't like gravity. You can't like a force. You can't really believe in it. You can only look at things that happen and judge the value of those things that happen. So in a free trade situation, we could say, oh, certain good things happen because of free trade, certain bad things happen. Well, let's make laws against the bad stuff. That's what tariffs are. That's what protectionism is. That's what all this shit we do is. So it's like, you can't really believe in free trade unless you also believe in the foundational stuff, which is what you really believe in, is cosmopolitanism, mercantilism, and, this sort of exchange value, not creation value, but just money move in, that's what you actually believe in. And because he makes a good point, because he says in the entire field of economics, there's nothing in economics that actually holds that prosperity is better than poverty, because economics seeks to maximize efficiency. This is kind of what we were talking about. Economics wants things to move faster and more efficiently, but it doesn't. Your prosperity, you being rich and happy, doesn't actually factor into that at all. Yeah. And that's why when economists say things that are efficient, but that's not implying anything good for people. And so you can kind of, there's not really to believe in there. We can believe in is that it should benefit the people. They're just saying, like, this machine's working faster. Isn't that good? He makes an interesting point here that kind of harkens back to what I was saying before. He says, like, the main problem with the global free trade system now is he calls perverse efficiency. I like that word, perverse efficiency, which is just maximizing utility for the sake of utility, coupled with, this is my note here, a fucked up time horizon. That's not his word, that's my word. And which means no future planning. And he says that leads to the current debt crisis. And he makes a point here about, the debt crisis in America specifically. He cites America as an example of why this is going wrong. He says, 500 million people in China have cell phones and only 1 million of them have credit cards. So that's worth noticing. So like the credit crisis in China is much, much worse than America. Like, you cannot conceive of a world in the West, in North America specifically, where you're not living on credit. Credit is such a fundamental, taking massive loans just to live is such a fundamental part of our existence, but it's not the existence in a lot of other countries. That's why he's not a cheerleader of China in any way, but you can look at the Chinese system. I can look at the Chinese system and say, I think there's a lot they're doing right. And I'll go on record and say there's a lot about China in their policies that I think makes sense. What I don't like about China is it's being done by Chinese people. And that's not just a joke. That's me saying that a lot, everyone gets the nationalism they deserve. A nationalist nation will, of course, look and act different in an Anglo nation than it will in a Chinese nation, than it will in an African nation. That's just because a nation is inexorably tied to the attitudes and the history and the ethnicity and the values of the people. And if it is just a machine of the state, you're in a broken country. You're just in that cosmopolitan hellscape. So a lot of the stuff I don't like about China is just because Chinese people behave that way. They don't really value human life. It's how they do business that we don't like. So a lot of it isn't the system itself. It's just, this is how these people do things, and I hate it. Which is why, dealing with like Indians too. It's like, I understand like your system works. The way you treat people, if you had an Indian boss, you know what the fuck I'm talking about. If you've dealt with an Indian guy who thinks he's in the power position, you'll know what I'm talking about. Like, I can't deal with you. You view me as your slave right now.
Yeah.
Every Indian guy in a tie sees you as a slave. Put that up on the board. And this book, I think, most of its relevance is explaining the state of the world in 2011. So there's obviously going to be some changes, but to give the context of all the stuff we're talking about, he says, if you think about it, only about a third of the countries in the world participate in the global economy. Now that's relevant. So when we talk about the world economy, people just kind of imagine every country is participating. No, not really. There's only a third of the nations are even playing this game. So even using the term global trade is kind of a trick. And then once you realize that, you realize, oh, how does this trade actually break down? And like we said, there are countries that kind of hold all the cards, and there's other ones that think they do, but in fact, they're just tech agricultural states to the actual sovereign manufacturing nation. And traditionally, these would have been like Japan as an example. Once again, Britain is an example. America is a great example. And there's a lot of companies they offshore their stuff to, who don't, for whatever reason, they don't use that as a reason to build up their own shit. And he made a funny point here that a lot of the cases that they use to encourage using these vassal states is that, the thing we're doing raises them out of poverty. He makes a good point. This is a trick they do in the statistics. He's like, global poverty, when this was written, was defined at $2 a day. So he's like, so if we pay them $2.01 a day, we've raised them out of poverty. So in a lot of these cases, nothing really changes. There's this talk, like there's all this wealth being generated. It's like, maybe a bit, but it's negligible. And again, you can blame the people themselves for not making hay while the sun is shining. I buy that as a reason. I also believe that there is sort of a vulture capitalism aspect to it as well. I can also believe that there is, manipulation by these companies. There's a few things, but I'm just saying, I don't want people to think it's just like, how dare they set up how dare they not let Mexico become a better nation? It's like, well, there was no reason for Mexico to be as shitty as it is. There's a lot that Mexico could have done to raise the wealth, and it just didn't. Same thing with these African countries. And, just on the topic of America, he makes the point, America imports more than it exports, and this is a recipe for disaster, which results in the deficit, and it's not actually creating new jobs. And just like we were saying with raising people out of poverty by raising their wages like a cent, this is the trick that, Obama was big on this by saying, we're getting Americans back to work. Quote, back to work. Well, what does that actually mean? That means that whereas before they were working full-time jobs, now they're working part-time jobs, or they're technically back to work, but they're making way less than they used to, and there's no job security, or they're driving an Uber counts as a job, whereas you got fired from your engineering job, whatever it might be. So there's all these little tricks of language that they use to endorse this stuff. And the problem is that, modern finance doesn't actually see this as a problem. They don't see trade deficits as a problem. They hand wave it away as something they can do about later. So we're dealing with economists who, as we were talking about before, don't see the fact that we don't make anything anymore. That's what people always say. We used to build things in this country, and that instinct is right. That instinct to say we don't build anything in this country anymore. What the fuck is up with that? We would laugh at those people. That type of guy who says that was a joke. A joke in popular culture. The old conservative guy, we used to build things in this country. What happened? A crotchety old guy. And we're supposed to laugh and say, oh, he's stuck in the past. It's like, well, pump the brakes. He's right. What's your solution? Is it just selling off assets? Is it just we can just import everything forever? That doesn't make any fucking sense. Yeah. If you're a nation that survives primarily on imports, what the fuck are you doing? That should scare you. It should really scare you. Mm-hmm. And they do, and people just don't think about it as much. I didn't think about it. I'm like a lot of people. I thought they must have figured something out. I would make excuses all the time, like, okay, this seems to be working. Maybe there's an angle here that I'm missing, and there's not. It's just a ticking clock that hasn't hit zero yet.
Yep.
And it's probably won't hit zero. It'll just get progressively worse until you wake up one day and you are a slave and it's too late. And he made a point. He's like, we actually don't. one of the problems is that we don't measure productivity overall. What we do is we measure productivity on things and industries that we trade globally with. So we're bad at actually telling if what we're producing, if what we're manufacturing is working and is good for people. We can tell that the stuff we trade with is selling well, and so we think we're doing a good job. But that's not the whole story. He makes a good example of Portugal. Now, Portugal, this is an example of a nation that seems to have done it all right, but not really, because there's a ceiling on them. So what Portugal does, like wine, a lot of these countries, they're great at producing wine, and they're the best at producing wine. They own the industry on wine. But the funny thing about wine is it doesn't have laddered externalities, really. Like it's kind of like agriculture. You're kind of making this product. It's globally known, but you're making as much wine as you're probably able to, and you're stuck there. And that's a short, but on the outside, man, you guys cornered the market on wine. You're trading so much in wine, but is that actually good? Is that the best case scenario for all the people? Does that increase the productivity of everything else? Does it raise other industries? Or are you just going to be a wine making country forever? And if that's what you want to be, fine. There's some countries where that's all you're going to be. Okay. But for other nations who maybe want a bit more sovereignty or maybe want a bit more control, and don't forget about tourism countries like Italy doesn't know. I don't know. Italy doesn't know whether it's coming or going. Italy's out to lunch right now.
Yeah.
So look at and Italy was the first guy who figured it out. Venice figured when they were just city states. They're the niggas who figured this shit out.
I mean, Italy is the UK of the Mediterranean. Like, and all through antiquity, they have the perfect position geographically and agriculturally, and in terms of people and the defensibility of the terrain. Like, there's so many reasons that Italy should actually be the economic center of that region, and they were for 1,000 years, and now they're not. So, and what is it? You hit it right on the head. It's the people, fucking Italians.
Yeah, you can't, and we can all debate about what percentage of the problem that is, but it's there. You can't ignore it. You can't ignore the attitude and the work ethic of the people, and work ethic does matter. There are just people who are better at being industrious. That's what fucking Scandinavia is kind of known for. That's what Germany is known for. That's what the Anglos are actually known for. They're the Protestant work ethic. All that shit. And what we're describing is the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So an absolute advantage is a country that just produces it and sells its own stuff cheaper, and they make it themselves. You make a thing and you sell it. That's an absolute advantage. A comparative advantage is different. That's the way it's kind of run now, like we were describing. That's the way they want it. And it allows countries to produce just what they do best. So I'm the best at, he gives the example of Bangladesh and t-shirts. Like Bangladesh I'm the best at producing t-shirts, and that's all I do. And they you deal with a lot of these companies that do like screen printing, on demand printing for making shirts, pants, whatever. A lot of it's done in Bangladesh. They've cornered the market on that. Now, that locks Bangladesh into being the t-shirt country forever. And they put all of their resources in developing that, all the resources that they could. Now, maybe there's a pathway out of them for that. That's fine. But a lot of the free trade proponents would like them staying there. They would prefer it if Bangladesh just stayed the cheapest manufacturer of t-shirts out there. Like a lot of these nations would prefer that you as a nation don't get a bit more sovereignty. You're the best at producing tires. Or like, a bad example, because this is actually good, Seattle with airplanes. Seattle makes so many fucking airplanes. It's insane. I have a gun in my mouth right now how much Seattle makes airplanes. I don't have that note in front of me. I remember that. I hope I don't got to buzzer myself on that. But, but that's a good industry. Then there's some where it's like, oh, you're the best known for this one kind of kitschy. You're the best in making triangle hats, rice patty hats. If you put all your horses in that, you can do it, but you're locked in there forever. And that's called a comparative advantage. That I produce this the best in the world, but the thing you produce is actually relatively benign and small. And you're kind of stuck there. You're in that sort of ghetto forever. And they're saying what they're trying to do with global trade is that every nation will just do that. There will be no national sovereignty because every nation will put all of its eggs in one specific basket. That's what they want. And that's what, talk to Klaus Schwab, talk to the World Trade Organization. They like that because, like, oh my God, that means everyone's going to be interdependent, which means less conflict and less war, which is true to a sense. But that's why you have to realize the fight you're in right now is between peace and sovereignty. And you need to figure out which side you want. And if you want sovereignty, you will not be on the side of peace. And you need to be ready for that. And I'm not trying to say you're going to be pro-war, but you're going to be, if you want the ability to have freedom, and this is, maybe I'm speaking the language of the anarchists and the libertarians here, and I should, because this fight crosses a lot of political lines. Like, you are fighting for the entire idea of sovereignty. Now, a lot of the fascists will say that's national or racial sovereignty. The anarchists will say that's individual sovereignty. What I'm saying is you're locked into battle with the idea of sovereignty, period. And that's what the powers that be are trying to do, is make it so they're trying to sell you on peace at the loss of all forms of not only national but individual sovereignty. That's why a lot of these things we're saying echo, in different sorts of spheres. So anyway, and like we were saying, and keep in mind that economic growth is path dependent. So I guess I'll just jump ahead to the end here, because we are getting kind of long, but this is very, very good. And it's going to come up, and this ties directly to our last clip on great power politics and political sovereignty. So that's political sovereignty. This is economic sovereignty. Both are tied together. But this one's actually practical, because like we said in the last book, there's steps we can take right now to make things better. Like, this doesn't actually need a huge fiery revolution. That's what's so fucking crazy to me. Just from a nationalist point of view, like, if you just employed more protectionist trade policies, things would turn around within a generation. You can bring manufacturing back. You can allocate money correctly to fund manufacturing and R&D within your country, and to give money to those. And this is what we used to fucking do. Entire towns and cities were propped up because of this. There's a great lie that every single fucking city was a port town, was this fucking mercantilist mishmash. No, you can actually have cities where it's built around an industry, and it builds organically from there. And all the businesses that serve that industry, and this could be everything from, a mining town's a bad example, but this is where most of the American cities were done. This is fucking Detroit. You want to talk about the death of cities, talk about Detroit, talk about that, the betrayal of this sort of global free trade economics did there. There was no reason Detroit needed to fall, other than maybe no one wanted their cars. But even then, just old cars used to be better. Every car sucks now. Every SUV is exactly the same. I'm getting off on another thing. I've got so many lathers on me. I'm worked up. So yeah, there's ways to make national economics better. Good industrial policy. So, and this is the comparative advantage that is shaped and created rather than just reactive, and creating a sovereignty of production. You can do this. We used to do this. Another one, here's an actual political policy that you could enact right now, a rolling content requirement. So let's say you've got a new industry and you're trying to invest in it, and you're trying to build it up into something that raises up everything around it. Now, to start, you might need to start pulling in imports from around the world. So you have what's called a rolling content requirement. And a rolling content requirement requires that an increasing percentage of the final value of the product has to be made locally. So if you're making a car, okay, I'm building the car here, but I'm getting shipments in, I'm getting the tires shipped in from here. It's like, okay, we'll do that. Over the next 5 to 10 years, you need to have those tires, you need to source those tires from here. And we need to figure out how that is. So now you're creating tire manufacturing in a nearby city or something. You see what I'm saying? So you can actually, over a long period of time, make requirements that you can start investing now, but over time you need to have all of it produced here. And let's chart a course for how that happens. And maybe we put in tax incentives, maybe we put in bursaries, maybe we put in grants, whatever it is. We'll chart a course, and that's how you do it. And maybe that takes less than a generation to do that. And keeping in mind that if you have these national industries, also you need to have global competition. Like, you actually do investing everything in one industry. It can become this monopolistic evil thing. So keep in mind, you do want competition. You do want a lot of the benefits of the free market, which is not having this just one nationalized monolithic thing, state central planning, central committee. You actually don't want that, not for even moral reasons, but from practical reasons. Like, you need to make sure that this company is staying, competitive and fresh. And just create protectionist policies with tariffs. Just start having import tariffs. We can do this right fucking now. And if you are increasing tariffs, lower taxes in other areas. Again, these are policies that people used to have. Increase tariffs, lower taxes, so the people don't suffer, so you don't have these austerity conditions. He had said that a flat tariff of 3%. If you have a flat tariff on everything, it would not help with low-end jobs like t-shirts, but would likely chase manufacturing back. A tariff will also self-target infant industries, the ones we actually want to target. So he makes a good point that the growth of these industries, if you chart it on a graph, there is a sharp curve where most of the profit happens right at the beginning. Right, it's like sharp, and then it kind of goes down over time, and then it normalizes over time. So he said the infant industry, the beginning of these industries starting to develop, is when you want to start charting the course, when you want to start investing money, when you want to start implementing these things right there. You don't want to actually come into these like already settled industries. That's where it gets hard. So it's new industries, it's infant industries, and it's creating those ladder externalities right around then. And then that's how you do it. This is literally how you do it. These are things you could vote on. This is what's so fucking, bananas to me, because so much of the stuff we talked about cultural stuff, historical stuff, identity-based stuff, that's very complicated. That's going to take, decades, if not, generations to turn back the clock on. This is shit you could vote on now. And the problem he points out is that every politician says they're going to do this. Obama said he was going to do this. Trump said he's going to. Trudeau probably said he was going to do this. He's going to bring back manufacturing, right? That's how you get votes, because the people want it too. The people want manufacturing back. They want these jobs back, and the politicians say it, and then they just don't. So I'm like, the wall there isn't that people don't get it. They get it. It's not that it's not desired. It is desired. It's not that you couldn't do it. One guy could do it. One leader, federal leader, could do it, and they just don't. And that's where the frustration is. We could fix the poverty thing. Isn't some inexorable problem, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, as ever, the problem is democracy.
And like I said, industry. Here's the quote from the book: industries that scale, the ones we want, the manufacturing ones, industries that scale do so on a curve where the biggest savings on production and output are at the beginning. Then those benefits lower over time. If you can catch an industry during the infant phase and force them into ladder externalities, then they will likely stay there and be more invested in producing capital nationally. So that's why, this is why I think a lot of governments are interested in startups, but anything else, like get it early, build these relationships. You can get them decoupled from this global import export thing. And actually it'll be a bit more difficult at the beginning, but what the fuck, why not use all your taxes for this?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Like, people are like, I'm not saying get rid of all taxes, but I'm like, this, if you allocated the money here, this would solve a lot of the other stuff you're spending taxes on, except, like we talked about earlier, certain groups of people that will never just exist in this system. Certain groups of people who you can't get them to work. So we'll leave it at that. There's a lot of like case studies he got from history. Maybe we can talk about these some other time. Just talk about how China, a good example, China's protectionism. They look at every policy China has right now. They call it draconian. They call it fascist. They call it every name in the book, but it's working for China. And any issues we might have that are probably the fact that this is just how Chinese people do things. There's cases we can track over the 20th century how automakers are forced to cut wages to stay competitive. There's studies that show free trade accounts for up to 25% of income inequality. Even going back to colonial times, even going back to the times of our history where all the wrong people we hate, they say, look how evil they were back then. Income inequality was a lot less back then. Think of that. Income inequality was less back when there was like horses and buggies and shit. So it's like when they talk about like, oh, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Like back then, when there was more actual nationalist economic policies, you had more stuff being done nationally. Like, you know, people were better off financially. You know, you still had rich people, you still had slave owners, I'm sure, but statistically, you know, things used to be, there was fewer huge gaps. You know, and then I guess there's just a part here. Yeah, there's a part about Japan, about what I said, the flying geese strategy. This is how Japan broke into foreign markets. You wonder where Japan, all this, where did this manufacturing superpower called Japan come from? Because Japan was, remember, cut off from the entire world for 2 centuries. You didn't hear from Japan. You didn't know a single Japanese person. If you knew a Japanese person, you're a liar. But they did this thing called the flying geese strategy to break into these markets and then to shore up their manufacturing base, not only in Japan, but also in their kind of allied countries, which is what China's trying to do now. Like they're trying to bring as much economic sovereignty to their part of the world. And I think that should be frightening for Westerners. And we can joke all we want about, oh, China makes garbage products, they are a paper tiger, they're not going to be, I know, like a lot of what they say about China is way overblown. I'm not actually threatened by them militarily, but there is something to be said for the manufacture that China's doing, that they're trying to increase their capabilities to manufacture more, and they have the political capital of more people. We have less people, less sovereignty, and less ability to marshal our forces if necessary. And no matter how you slice it, that's bad. No matter how you slice that in terms of war or economics or culture or anything, that's bad. And I think the economics one is actually the easiest one to solve. And I'm just hitting my head against the wall. Like what at this point, the I don't want to sound like I'm Fed posting here, but there are specific people who are just standing in the way of this. And if you removed those people, I think a lot of this stuff would just start taking action on its own. I mean, there's people right now online I've talked to who said that America is very aggressively onshoring a lot of its manufacturing right now. And it actually is bringing some manufacturing back. If that's the case, that's the case. Good. More of that. But that is also in the interest of preserving this thing called sovereignty, which in a very philosophical, almost metaphysical sense, I think people need to view this as part of a larger war. And anyway, do you have any thoughts on that? I know I spoke a lot. My throat's fucking tired, but
no, it's all right. I mean, we can chat through it. It's good.
I was saying, what do you think about that? It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's decent.
Pretty I know. I think what I liked about this was I think it bridged a lot of gaps between what people thought when they hear nationalist economics. They get these ghouls in their head, what they think represents that, or I'm a libertarian, so I'm over here. I'm a fascist, I'm over here. I'm a Marxist, I'm over here. I'm like, you know what? If you actually break it down, there's a lot more bridges that could be built between these different ideologies, especially now. I think because there's a lot of obvious things.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to build this up sometime, but I think the underlying principles of like Lulbert principles, ANCAP principles, without value judgment, will be brought forward into a nationalist future. I think that they can underpin a lot of things that work, but they're so autistic that when you apply them, like Adam Smith, like a lot of modern Lulberts, you get something that's totally unworkable in the modern world. And I think that's part of that interaction is part of the pipeline of libertarianism into right-wing ideology, is that if you are an intelligent and socialized person, you might pick up those libertarian principles when you're younger. And then through experience in the real world, you say, yes, these principles are true. They make sense. They're reasonable. But then when you start layering culture and morality and spirituality and lived experience on top of that, you say, okay, so these are guiding principles in certain selective situations, but there's a lot more to life than that. But they're still great tools. And I think the whole point to this, even both of these guys are saying, nobody's saying free trade is evil. We're saying that free trade is a weapon which can be used for good or for evil. right?
Yeah, I think you had this line that I love, and I say this all the time. And I told people that you came up with it, but I'm going to stop telling people. I'm going to say it came from me. It was something like, "It's necessary, but it's not sufficient."
Oh, I didn't come.
I
I
love that
didn't come
line.
up with that. I heard somebody else say that, but I love saying it's necessary but not sufficient. Yeah, yeah. Free trade is necessary but insufficient.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like, and that's what people trying to answer these questions, these practical questions, the questions that emerge in the world that you live in. And are you, and you know, once we dig into it, it's like, okay, what's beneath this thing called free trade? What it actually is, what we said, and this is really the heart of Frederich List critique, is that beneath free trade is what the actual belief is, which is like global cosmopolitanism and mercantilism as an ideology. Whereas free trade is just, it's a fact. It's an arena. It's kind of like, it's just a thing. It's neither hot nor cold. Like we said, you know, economics is about efficiency. It's not really about prosperity. It's
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
That's kind of a side effect. So, and we're saying, well, prosperity is important to us and sovereignty is important to us, and they're just saying, don't worry about it.
Yeah,
Forget
I mean,
about
look,
it.
the cosmopolitan shit is almost a cult of trade or cult of free trade, where it's like it's for people who love the prosperity and maybe they're third generation merchants and they don't understand the economic principles at work and they don't understand their own society because they're born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And these are the people that say, you know, I was born in a port city full of all this wealth, and why would I ever want anything different? Everybody should be like this. No, I mean, your money did come through those mechanisms, but you clearly don't understand those mechanisms, because when you apply them to other places, it actually enslaves them, right? So
Yeah.
it's not that those mechanisms are bad. They made you very wealthy and they made a lot of people happy. That's great. We should keep them. But my whole thing is to know, because there are people that think that free trade is actually morally bad, and there are people that think that we should onshore everything, and that regardless of the efficiency of it, we should be producing literally every product locally as much as we can. I think that's retarded, but at the same time,
Yeah.
you know, there's a balance. So
Well, and that I should talk to that too, because in the books they talk about this, where he says, like, look, we are not actually arguing for like making everything yourself. You should make a lot of very, very key stuff and have this ability. But he's like, there's opportunity cost. He calls it an opportunity cost, where it's like, you know, by getting someone else to do something for you, that does free up time and resources for yourself. And
right.
as long as you are doing something useful with that, that's good. Like, you know, so this is not against, you know, the idea of trade. You know, that's kind of where we're trying to get at, like the idea of nations trading, and the idea of certain nations will necessarily have to focus on certain industries because we have geographic issues to deal with. The fact of the matter is, there's only some nations aren't by the water and they can't do certain things. They can't produce certain things. And there's all kinds of geographic issues. There's the fact that a lot of countries, they're not in the most temperate zone, so they can't. There's some stuff they can't do. It's actually very difficult to manufacture stuff in Canada and in Russia, but you can find certain ways around that, with in mind that you shouldn't just be sacrificing everything. So they do address that in the books. I just didn't get to it that much.
That's all right.
Yeah, this was a very good one. The next one's going to be bad.
Oh no.
You guys better strap in for the next
talk
episode.
about Johnny Depp again.
You were going I was going to talk about it this time, but I didn't.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.